Every human culture that has ever existed believed in something beyond the physical world. Not most cultures, not the majority, every single one, across every continent, across every climate, across thousands of years of complete isolation from each other. Cultures that had no contact whatsoever, separated by oceans, by mountains, by tens of thousands of years, all independently arrived at the same conclusion. There is something out there, something that watches, something that acts, something that exists beyond what you can touch or see or explain. That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern, and patterns in human behavior, this consistent, this universal, this stubbornly persistent across every barrier that should have broken them, those patterns come from somewhere very deep. Something in the human brain, not the human culture. Something older than any religion that still exists today. Today we are asking the question that billions of people have asked in one form or another, but that almost nobody has asked about ancient humans specifically. Did they believe in God? Not the God of any particular religion, not any specific doctrine or text or tradition, but the raw impulse, the thing underneath all of those, the feeling that the world is inhabited by invisible forces with intentions, that death is not the end, that something beyond ordinary experience is real. When did that start? What caused it? And why, after everything humans have learned about the physical world, does it persist? The answers are not what most people expect, and the most surprising one flips the entire history of civilization upside down. Start with the biology, because religion didn't come from nothing. It came from a brain feature, a specific cognitive tendency that evolved for practical survival reasons and then produced something nobody predicted. The feature is called agency detection, and you use it every day without knowing it. Here is how it works. Your brain is constantly scanning the environment for signs of other agents, other beings, with intentions, motivations, and the capacity to act. This scanning is ancient, automatic, and happens below conscious thought. When you hear a sound in a dark room, your brain immediately asks, is something there? When you see movement in your peripheral vision, the same question fires instantly. When you smell something unfamiliar, when the wind shifts unexpectedly, when a pattern appears in the texture of bark or the shadows of leaves, your brain asks, before you have consciously thought anything, is something out there? This is a survival feature. In the ancient environment, the things most likely to kill you were other agents, predators, and rival humans. Detecting them early, before they detected you, was often the difference between surviving and not. And crucially, the cost of a false positive is much lower than the cost of a false negative. If you hear a sound and assume it's a predator, when it's actually wind, you wasted a few seconds of alertness. If you hear a sound and assume it's wind when it's actually a predator, you die. So natural selection produced a brain that errs heavily on the side of detecting agents that might not be there. A brain that sees faces in clouds, hears intention in thunder, feels presence in empty rooms. A brain that is, in the technical language of cognitive scientists, hyperactive in its agency detection. And here is where religion enters. When your hyperactive, agency-detecting brain is faced with the most powerful, most unpredictable, most uncontrollable forces in the natural world, lightning, earthquakes, drought, disease, death, it does exactly what it was built to do. It asks, is there an agent behind this? Is something causing this intentionally? The answer your brain generates automatically before reason can interfere is yes, something is there. Something did this on purpose. Every thunder god, every god of harvest, every spirit of the river and the wind and the mountain, every supernatural being that has ever existed in any human tradition, they all started here, in a brain feature that evolved to detect predators applied to phenomena too large and too powerful to be predators. Religion, in this view, is not irrational. It is the completely predictable output of a survival-optimized brain in an environment it wasn't quite designed for. What did the spiritual world actually look like to ancient humans? Not in the organized doctrinal sense of later religion, but in the raw, immediate, daily sense of how they experienced reality. The answer is animism, and it is so different from modern religious frameworks that most people struggle to really picture it. Animism is not a primitive form of religion that later evolved into something more sophisticated. It is a complete and coherent way of experiencing the world, one in which the boundary between living and non-living, between natural and supernatural, simply does not exist in the way we take for granted. In an animist framework, everything has agency. Not just animals and people, rivers, mountains, specific trees, particular rocks, weather patterns, the sun, the moon, fire. Everything that acts, moves or changes is understood as having some form of intention behind it. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the literal experienced reality of a human being whose brain has no alternative explanatory framework for why a river floods, why lightning strikes one tree and not another, why the migration patterns of animals shift without warning. The only explanation that was cognitively available was the same explanation that worked for everything else. Something with intentions caused this. The evidence for animist belief in ancient humans comes from multiple directions. The Chauvet cave in southern France, with its extraordinary paintings dated to roughly 36,000 years ago, depicts animals with a level of observational detail and apparent reverence that suggests something beyond simple decoration. The animals are painted in motion, in depth, with attention to individual character. There are half-human, half-animal figures entities that exist between categories, which is exactly what you would expect from a worldview where the boundary between human and animal is not fixed, but fluid. The oldest musical instruments, bone flutes found in German caves dated to at least 40,000 years ago, suggest ritual use. Music, cross-culturally, is one of the most powerful and consistent methods of inducing altered states of consciousness, of creating the feeling of contact with something beyond the ordinary. That ancient humans were making instruments this early suggests they were already using sound to access something they believed was real. And then there is the ochre, the red pigment that appears in burial sites across Africa, Europe and Asia, spanning tens of thousands of years, applied to bodies, applied to bones, applied to the walls of caves, red, the color of blood, of fire, of life, used consistently across cultures with no contact with each other, in contexts clearly associated with death and ceremony. And then there is the ochre, the red pigment that appears in burial sites across Africa, Europe and Asia, spanning tens of thousands of years, applied to bodies, applied to bones, applied to the walls of caves, red, the color of blood, of fire, of life, used consistently across cultures with no contact with each other, in contexts clearly associated with death and ceremony. Something was being communicated, something was being done deliberately, ritually, repeatedly, something that the people doing it believed mattered. But perhaps the most striking single piece of evidence comes from Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to 75,000 years ago. Researchers found pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines, deliberate, repeated, non-functional marks, no animal, no figure, just abstract pattern, made for no practical purpose by someone who clearly intended to make it. Abstract thought is the prerequisite for religious thought. You cannot believe in an invisible God without first being able to hold in your mind something that does not physically exist. Those geometric lines in a South African cave, 75,000 years old, are evidence that the cognitive door to the supernatural was already open, that somewhere in that mind, something beyond the immediately visible was already real. Now, we get to the discovery that changed everything scientists thought they knew about religion and civilization. And it happened at a site most people outside archaeology have never heard of. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, a region called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill. He found stone pillars, massive T-shaped limestone columns, some standing 6 meters tall and weighing up to 50 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and covered in extraordinary carved reliefs of animals. Foxes, snakes, vultures, lions, scorpions, boars, symbols that appear to carry cosmological meaning. The site dated to approximately 9,500 BCE, that is 12,000 years ago. This is older than Stonehenge by 7,000 years. Older than the Egyptian pyramids by 6,000 years, older than the invention of writing, older than pottery, older than any domesticated plant or animal. And here is the thing that stopped everyone cold. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They had no agriculture, no metal tools, no permanent settlements. They were hunter-gatherers, nomadic people following animals across the landscape, living in temporary camps, with no surplus of food and no centralized authority that anyone had previously believed capable of organizing monumental construction. Before Göbekli Tepe, the story of civilization was clear. First, you get agriculture. Agriculture creates surplus. Surplus allows permanent settlements. Settlements allows specialization. Specialization produces priests and leaders. And finally, at the very end of this sequence, temples and organized religion. Göbekli Tepe demolished this sequence completely. Here was a temple, a massive, organized, clearly intentional ceremonial structure requiring coordinated labor from hundreds of people over generations, built by people with no farms, no cities, no writing, and no pottery, before any of the things we thought were prerequisites for religion. As Schmidt himself put it, first came the temple, then the city. What this means is staggering. Religion did not emerge from civilization. Religion, or at least the shared spiritual impulse powerful enough to organize large groups of people around a common purpose, may have been what created civilization. The belief in something beyond ordinary experience may have been the first force powerful enough to pull scattered nomadic bands together into the kind of cooperative, organized effort that eventually produced everything else. The sacred space came before the settlement. The temple came before the town. God, or something that functioned like God, may have been the original architect of human society. Here is where the science gets truly fascinating. Because even if religion started as a byproduct of agency detection, even if the first spirits were just predator detection applied to thunder, it didn't stay that way. It was co-opted. It became something genuinely useful, something that gave groups who had it a survival advantage over groups that didn't. The mechanism is what researchers call pro-social behavior. Groups cooperate better when their members believe they are being watched by something that cares about their behavior. Not necessarily an all-powerful God in the modern theological sense, but any sufficiently powerful supernatural agent that is believed to monitor individual actions and punish selfishness. In a small group of 25 people, this surveillance is basically real. Your neighbors actually do see what you do and can punish you for cheating, free riding, or breaking agreements. But as groups get larger, this real social monitoring breaks down. You can't personally watch everyone. You can't know everyone's private behavior. The people at the edges of the group are effectively unobservable. A belief in supernatural watchers solves this problem. If people genuinely believe that a spirit or ancestor or God is watching them, even when no human is, their behavior changes. Studies of modern populations consistently show that reminders of supernatural observation increase pro-social behavior, reduce cheating, and increase cooperation with strangers. Ancient humans who believed that the ancestors were watching, that the spirits of the forest were paying attention, that some force beyond the human community was monitoring their actions, those humans cooperated better, shared more fairly, fought within the group less, and groups that cooperated better outcompeted groups that didn't. Religion, in this view, was not just an accidental output of a misfiring brain feature. It was a social technology, perhaps the first and most powerful social technology humans ever developed. A way of extending the benefits of small group cooperation into larger and larger collectives, by replacing the limited reach of actual human observation with the unlimited reach of an imagined but behaviorally real supernatural observer. The gods did not need to be real for their effects to be real. The belief in them was enough. So what did ancient humans actually believe in? Not in the organized theological sense, but in the specific, daily, lived sense of what they thought was out there. The earliest evidence points consistently to three overlapping categories. The first is animal spirits. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, spanning from 36,000 to 15,000 years ago, are overwhelmingly of animals, not landscapes, not plants, not abstract patterns. Animals depicted with extraordinary care and skill in their most powerful and characteristic poses. The bear that rears upright, the bison charging, the horses running in a herd. These are not decoration. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer groups with similar practices describe them as ritual ways of communicating with, appeasing, or harnessing the power of the animal whose life you are about to take. The hunt was not just economic, it was spiritual. The animal had to give itself. You had to ask for permission. You had to perform the correct rituals before, during, and after the kill. Failure to do so risked the withdrawal of the animal's cooperation, and with it, starvation. The second is ancestor spirits. Across virtually every ancient culture that left evidence, the dead did not fully depart. They continue to exist in some form, present but invisible, capable of affecting the living, requiring ongoing relationship through ritual, offering, and remembrance. The burials at Çatalhöyük, where the dead were buried under the floors of homes and periodically exhumed to have their bones painted and handled, this is not morbid, it is relational. The dead were still part of the household. The third, and the one that most directly answers the question of whether ancient humans believed in God, is sky beings. Across the Upper Paleolithic, there is growing evidence of cosmological thinking, of attention to the sun, moon and stars as meaningful agents. The alignment of Göbekli Tepe with specific astronomical events suggests that the builders were tracking celestial movements and attributing significance to them. The sky was not empty. It was inhabited, and what inhabited it was powerful, cyclical, and clearly in charge of things that mattered enormously: the seasons, the migrations, the floods and droughts that determined survival. The specific god of any modern religion did not exist in 50,000 BCE, but something did, something that watched, something that the world belonged to, something that required relationship, ritual and respect, something whose goodwill needed to be sought and whose anger needed to be avoided. Call it what you want, the shape of the belief is recognizable from here. So, did ancient humans believe in God? Not in the sense of any specific doctrine or tradition that exists today. There was no theology, no written text, no organized church, no afterlife mapped in detail, no singular all-powerful creator in the way most modern religions describe, but in the deeper sense, the one underneath all of those, yes, completely, universally, and apparently inevitably. Every human population that has ever been studied believed in something invisible with intentions. Every ancient burial suggested belief in something beyond death. Every cave painting suggested ritual relationship with forces beyond the human. Every culture, independently, without contact, arrived at the same fundamental conclusion: the world is inhabited by more than what you can see. That universality is not accidental. It comes from a brain built to detect agents in uncertain environments, applied to the most powerful and uncertain forces in the ancient world. It comes from groups that cooperated better because they shared a belief in something watching. It comes from the campfire, where the dead were still present in stories, where the animals spoke in the painted caves, where the stars moved in patterns that clearly meant something. And it comes from a hilltop in Turkey, where 12,000 years ago, people with no farms and no cities and no writing somehow organized themselves to cut and move 50-ton stones, not to build shelter, not to store food, but to create a place where they could come together and stand before something larger than themselves, before civilization, before agriculture, before almost everything we think of as human progress. There was already this. The first human project was not survival, it was meaning. And that project, the attempt to understand what the world is, who is in it besides us, what we owe to the forces we cannot control, has never stopped. It is the longest continuous project in human history, older than any tool, older than any city, older than language itself possibly. Whatever you personally believe about what is or isn't out there, that impulse, that reaching towards something beyond the visible world, is the most ancient thing about you. It predates your culture, your language, your civilization. It was there before any of that existed. It may be the thing that made all of that possible.